Hello there my RPG lovers and welcome to another video. Sacred was a really interesting game series which introduced some unique gameplay ideas in this subgenre of RPGs. Back in early 2000s we had a bunch of new ARPGs on PC which were obviously heavily influenced by Diablo 2. Sacred managed to distinguish itself from the rest with a unique approach to class progression and an impressive open world that was not randomly generated. It also had some other very unique features for this genre of games, which are pretty hard to find even today. Sacred managed to sell over 1 million copies by 2005, making it a huge success for the small studio from Germany. Naturally, it was logical to expect a sequel after such a massive success of the first game. Ascaron Entertainment released Sacred 2 Fallen Angel in 2008 not only on PC but on Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. Sacred 2 had the same philosophy when it comes to the game design, and it also features an impressive open world to explore. The sequel managed to sell more than 750,000 copies by 2009, but unfortunately, that wasn't enough for Ascaron to pay its debts. In July 2009, the studio had to close down. That wasn't the end of the Sacred series though, but to be honest, it should have been, because it only goes downhill from this point on.
Are they climbing up the wall of that building?
Climb up my wall and something.
Calypso Media purchased the majority of the assets from Ascaron. It's estimated that around 15 people from Ascaron Studios continued working for Calypso Media. The action-adventure called The Inquisitor is the latest game from Calypso, which came out in February 2024. However, the license for the Sacred IP was bought by the publisher Deep Silver. Deep Silver hires a studio called Southend Interactive to develop a game called Sacred Citadel, a beat-em-up side-scroller that was basically just a spin-off Sacred game. But in 2014, we finally got to see another Sacred game in the main series. Deep Silver hired a studio called Keen Games to develop Sacred 3. The final entry in the Sacred series have been met with some heavy criticism. While the gameplay in Sacred 3 was actually pretty decent, the game simply had no similarities with previous Sacred RPGs. In fact, Sacred 3 hardly even had RPG features at all, it was more like a beat-em-up hack-and-slash action. It was obvious that whoever made the decision to abandon everything that Sacred games stand for made a terrible mistake, to say the least. But Keen Games were obviously talented enough to continue making good games, which don't carry heavy baggages from the past. And just recently, they found great success with a survival game called Enshrouded, which released in early access. That will be a brief history of Sacred RPGs. Now let's take a deep dive into all Sacred games, starting from the very beginning. The first Sacred game came out in 2004, exclusively on the PC. I had a lot of troubles trying to run this game properly nowadays, even though I followed a couple of different guides. It turns out I had a specific technical problem, which automatically caused my game to crash upon start. After bashing my head against the wall for a couple of hours, I figured out the problem. It was my dual monitor setting which caused the game to constantly crash, and I had to disable one of them. So if you try to play this game nowadays and you have a similar problem, I hope this can help you out as well. Putting that aside, Sacred felt extremely familiar to me from the very beginning. That's because I already played Sacred 2, and the first game obviously had a lot of similar gameplay mechanics. But the visual style of the game immediately brought back that early 2000s CRPG vibe. Now, obviously it's quite outdated for today's standards because it's freaking old, duh. But I still think this game looks beautiful. Like I said, it has that recognizable look which many CRPGs used to have back in the day, like Diablo 2, Divine Divinity and so on. I would argue that this game looks even better, and the open world looks impressive for a 2004 CRPG. There are many different towns and castles to explore and unique looking biomes. These populated places are really charming, with a lot of visual details. Even some smaller places that you're going to visit during the main quest are really nice to look at. The visual variety is very strong as well. You're going to explore forest areas, desert, a snowy area, and many different looking locations as well as dungeons. Speaking of locations, Sacred features a fully open world with no compromises. You're free to explore the map as soon as you make a new character, there are no limits. I'm not really sure about the level scaling and if enemies even have any form of scaling. I would assume that certain zones had different level requirements because I could find NPCs with at least a couple of levels higher than me. You can also outlevel enemies, which reduces their aggro range drastically. The majority of NPCs have crazy aggro range, they will start attacking you from very far away, which can be annoying sometimes. The gameplay in Sacred is very close to your typical ARPG, if not a bit clunkier. Even though the gameplay is a bit clunky, the game makes it up with various gameplay features, which are quite impressive for a 2004 RPG. I feel like I keep saying that, but it's true. From the very beginning you can buy a horse and explore the open world on a mount. You can even use almost all of your class abilities without needing to dismount. The horse has unique abilities as well, for example you can charge through enemies and knock them down. That's really impressive if you ask me, even for today's standards in this genre. Come to think of it, only Diablo 4 has something similar, to lesser extent. Diablo 4 was extremely disappointing for me on so many levels, and I'll probably make a video about that in the near future. Like I said, the gameplay felt really familiar to me in Sacred because I played Sacred 2 a lot. The action combat is fairly simple, and your experience will heavily depend on your class choice. You start off by choosing one of 9 available classes, each with their own unique skills to learn. All classes have unique armor pieces that you can find, while the weapons are a bit more flexible, although some of them have class requirements as well. The reason why I love these kinds of features in ARPGs is because it can incentivize you to try out different classes, especially if you find a very good item. And of course you can share all items you find by putting it into shared stash that you can find in all populated locations. The number of items you can equip is pretty impressive as well, and I love the fact that shoulder pads are a separate item category. I know it's a small thing, but these kinds of features greatly improve the visual progression of the game. Then again, the game is certainly showing its age, so it's not like you're going to have an amazing experience when it comes to visual progression of your character. This is something that the sequel does a lot better, simply because of its age. So what about the combat itself? Well, like I already mentioned, it's definitely a bit clunky. You attack monsters by simply clicking on them, and you have to hold the left mouse button for continuous auto attack. However, your character will just sometimes ignore those inputs and you stop attacking entirely for whatever reason. This is what makes the combat even more janky than it should be, and it can be annoying sometimes. I think this problem is magnified when you're fighting on your horse. Then again, Sacred is not a crazy fast ARPG, so the sluggish auto attacks didn't bother me that much. Speaking of which, there are some nice quality of life mechanics related to this. For example, if you're on your horse and you want to loot a specific item, your character will automatically dismount, pick up the item and go back to the horse. That was very cool to see, but it becomes kinda obsolete when you learn that you can use the auto loot button to pick up everything in the vicinity. Back to the combats. Sacred 1 unique class abilities work very similar to Diablo 2. You would select the ability you wish to cast and you need to press the right mouse button. However, when you level up, you get more quick slots that you can select by a press of a button and then press the right mouse button to cast. Same goes for the weapons you can equip. You have multiple sets for different weapon combinations. And of course, you can switch these weapon sets by pressing a corresponding button on the keyboard. Then we have a very unique gameplay feature, which Sacred is kinda known for. Combat arts allow you to combine up to 4 different abilities and cast them all at once, if possible. It's a very cool feature in Sacred, and I already know how it works because I played Sacred 2 before, which also has this feature. However, I didn't feel the need to use combat arts in this game that much, at least with my class. Do take in mind that I haven't invested like 100 hours into this playthrough and I still didn't unlock the highest difficulty, which would probably make the combat arts more relevant. But in order to unlock the highest difficulty, you need to have your character leveled up. Speaking of the difficulty, it's very forgiving actually, until you finally get to unlock higher difficulties. The Vampire Knight class has a very strong vampire form which allows you to cast unique abilities. You can also use different abilities in the human form and use melee and ranged weapons. I find it impressive how some of the abilities seamlessly adapt to your weapon type. For example, I can use this ability with a two-handed sword, but if I switch to the bow, I can also use it as a ranged projectile. This is nothing new when it comes to some newish ARPGs. It reminds me of Grim Dawn actually, because some of the abilities in that game work the same. You'll find a lot of these combat arts as a random item drops, so the character progression is a little bit random. Not to the extent where it becomes annoying, and you have the option to get the class specific cards by visiting a certain NPC. You can simply put 4 arts that you randomly collected and you'll get a unique card for the class that you're playing. It's a very cool system actually, and you'll get a ton of these arts as you kill enemies. Of course, you can choose to keep the arts if you plan to play other classes. What I did find a bit annoying is how enemies respawn in this game. As soon as you leave the dungeon or an instanced area, they instantly respawn, which feels very bad actually. Action RPGs usually do this when you leave the game and come back, which is a lot better way to do it. Every character begins in a different zone and you have a unique starting quest. I also played the Gladiator a little bit, and I like how he starts in a Colosseum, where you have to kill a couple of guys before you escape. Most quests in the game will give you some sort of a companion that you have to escort somewhere. I think this type of a quest is a bit overdone in the game, but these companions can usually be somewhat useful in combat. Although you can fail a bunch of side quests if you let the NPC die, which did happen a lot in my playthrough. I failed a bunch of quests. I love when RPGs allow you to fail quests. I think it's very important actually, but it's not a huge deal in this game. Overall, Sacred 1 still feels like an amazing RPG with a big open world. If you don't mind the age of the game, and if you're willing to make some compromises when it comes to the fluidity of the gameplay, I would still heavily recommend trying it out. Do take in mind that you might have some technical issues and that you can't run the game in HD resolution, at least I couldn't. Sacred 2 Fallen Angel came out in 2008 for PC, then in 2009 again for PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. The first game was exclusive for PC, but this time around we got to see a Sacred game on consoles as well. There are some notable differences between the console and the PC version. For example, the UI is completely different, and to be honest, I think it looks better on consoles. The game itself had some technical issues on consoles because the performance was, well, terrible. It frequently dropped below 30 FPS. The core gameplay is pretty much the same, but I would like to get the opportunity to try out these console ports in the future, just for the sake of it. I invested a lot of hours into this game on PC, and I always gladly come back for another playthrough. Unfortunately, my old saves were not saved, and I lost my high level Shadow Warrior. But that only meant that I got to play it again for the purposes of this video, and this time around I played with the Dryad class. Speaking of classes, they are a bit different in the sequel, even though Sacred 2 has the same design philosophy. You can choose between 7 different character classes, and all of them have a little backstory that plays.
Once I was a soldier. I proved myself in many battles. I never failed.
Some of the new classes are really unique, and I can't remember another ARPG which offered something similar. For example, I remember playing Temple Guardian a lot in the past, which has some very cool spells and very unique armor sets and weapons. Before you start the game, you also get to choose a campaign and a god that you worship. The differences between these two campaigns are not that big, you only get some new quests and dialogue here and there, but I selected Dark Campaign this time around. This also dictates the gods that you can select, which gives you a powerful spell to cast with a long cooldown. The intro cutscene for this game is extremely well done, and I think it's one of the best intros for any game ever, without exaggerating. It shows all classes fighting a bunch of enemies with a great song from the band Blind Guardian. Which, by the way, is also featured in the game itself. There is a funny quest related to the band, and even a full-blown concert in the game. This by itself should tell you a lot about the general vibe of the game. Sacred 2 doesn't take itself too seriously, and I think it works great because of it.
Ah! What do you mean?
The first game had some great humor as well, but Sacred 2 is definitely a lot goofier. The focus on humor is a bit over-exaggerated and in your face, and not everyone will prefer this.
I was able to accomplish a small wonder today. I managed to make the air smelly out of nothing.
In my case, this only made the game a lot more memorable in general, and I still remember a lot of random situations from the game. I think this game holds up really well in terms of graphics, although you have to do some manual tweaking if you want to get a high resolution. There is only one text document that you have to manually change if you want to have 4K resolution, but anything lower than that can be tweaked in the menu. Sacred 2 looks amazing in high resolution, and even most character models look decent for a 2008 isometric ARPG. The environments still look amazing, and the sheer variety of things to see in the game is outstanding. From populated places with bunch of unique buildings that you can explore, to big open fields and different looking biomes. There is just something specific about how RPGs from this time period look, and it's not just the vibrant color palette. Each class begins in a different zone, just like in the first game, and you're free to explore the world however you like. You can focus on the main story or do dozens of side quests along the way. Even though Sacred's 2 open world is massive, it's a little less open compared to the first game. The paths you can take are more narrow, which leaves a lot of space on the map inaccessible. Not a huge deal, but it's worth mentioning. While I was struggling to figure out if the level scaling exists in the first game, I can say for sure that Sacred 2 definitely uses a more aggressive style of level scaling. Enemies are always very close to your level, which is kinda dumb. But the game has a decent amount of challenge and it keeps you on your toes in most battles. The combat itself is not very fast and it's a bit clunky for today's standards. But the sheer variety of character builds, classes, itemization and everything else feels very deep. You can spend hundreds of hours customizing your build, killing strongest enemies and exploring every corner of the map. The general idea for the class progression is pretty much the same, although it's even deeper this time around. You can loot weapon arts from enemies, and just like in the first game, you have an NPC who can help you getting the ones you need. It's even easier than in Sacred 1 because you can select the exact weapon art you need, as long as you have the other weapon arts to invest. Your abilities have smaller passive trees that you can increase as well, which is a brand new feature. And now you have to select a bunch of passive skills to progress upon leveling up. This makes it easier to plan out your build and just dump leveling up points in abilities you wish to use. All classes have unique armor pieces and some weapons. I tried to do something different for this playthrough just to make it more interesting. I essentially played the game as a third-person action RPG with particular camera settings that you can get from the Steam guides. It's not perfect, but it works surprisingly well. Like I said, the gameplay is not extremely fast, especially in the beginning, so it doesn't require much precision. The combos are back, and you can combine a bunch of spells together. I did use a lot of combos for my Shadow Warrior before, but for my Dryad, I found it easier to just use my regular keybinds for spells. Although my character is still not very high level, so that could change in the future. It's still very impressive to see your character cast a bunch of abilities at once with only one button press. It's even more impressive when the casting animation continues on another enemy when your primary target dies. I also love how flexible the weapon system is in the game. I focused on ranged attacks, but I also started dumping points into sword weapon skill and I frequently switched between a couple of different weapon sets. The visual progression in the game can put to shame some new games in this genre. Each piece of gear looks unique and you have very nice looking items to collect regardless of your character class. Once again, all classes have exclusive gear that you can loot and equip, and you'll get items for all classes as you play. If you get into Sacred 2, you're probably going to play more than one class anyway. The mount system from the first game is back. This time around, each class has some unique mounts that you can get, but you also find a bunch of regular horses. Mounts feel better than before, and you have to get those unique mounts for your class if you plan to use your combat arts while mounted. You can't use combat arts on regular horses. I still think this game suffers a bit when it comes to transparency of objects, although even some brand new ARPGs like Last Epoch have the same issue. It's a nitpicky critique because it doesn't ruin the overall experience, but it's certainly annoying when it happens. Some dungeons are very annoying to explore because of this, and you're pretty much forced to constantly rotate the camera. Speaking of which, the ability to rotate the camera is always a very welcoming feature in ARPGs. Unfortunately, many new ARPGs don't allow you to do this. The only reason for that I can think of is because you actually have to make almost every asset in 3D, and if you can't rotate the camera, you can probably get away with some less complex 2.5D assets. Listen, I don't know what the f I'm talking about, I'm not a game developer, these are just my impressions. The bottom line is, I prefer to see a rotating camera in ARPGs. The bosses in the game can be really hard to kill, especially in early to mid game. The optional and side quest bosses you can find can have a ton of health and decent mechanics for a 2008 ARPG. The most important thing is, it's still very fun for me to kill these bosses and solve quests. I'm sure there is at least some dose of nostalgia here, but I still think this game aged pretty well, despite the jankiness. I think Sacred 2 did an amazing job as a sequel, although not every Sacred fan would agree. Many people prefer the first game, but to be honest, I think they are heavily influenced by nostalgia. It's by no means a bad game, Sacred 1 is still amazing, but I would recommend playing Sacred 2 if you only want to play one of these games. But if you have the time, you should play both of these games for sure. Sacred Citadel is a beat-em-up side-scroller that came out in 2013. This is obviously a spin-off game, and it wasn't developed by Ascaron like the first two Sacred games. In fact, Ascaron was closed down in 2009, unfortunately. Even so, we still got two more Sacred games that we need to talk about, and Sacred Citadel is one of them. For some stupid reason, the highest resolution you can select in this game is 1600 by 900. But you can change the resolution in the text file, and Full HD or 4K works fine when you do that. If you ever played any beat-em-up games, you'll know exactly what to expect here. Sacred Citadel didn't leave great first impressions on me. The controls and the combat in general are just fine. It's certainly not great, you can find much better beat-em-up games out there, that's for sure. That being said, I did enjoy my time with the game, which was cut short by a very big problem with the balancing, but we'll get to that soon. You can choose between 4 characters, and I selected a warrior, surprise surprise. The warrior duo wields one-handed weapons, but he also has a two-handed mace for strong attacks. You get a couple of simple attacks, but as you progress through the levels and level up, you get more combos that you can use. The combat system feels okay at best, if not a bit stiff because of the controls. Some of the hitboxes are pretty bad though, which can certainly be very annoying. However, if you choose to parry attacks at the right time, especially against bosses and elite enemies, you're not going to have a lot of issues with the hitboxes. You can easily stagger stronger enemies with a timed block, which opens the window to do some serious damage. What I didn't like too much when it comes to the boss fights is the number of regular enemies, which you also have to deal with. Then again, I think the game is meant to be played in co-op, which is very obvious, even though the single player mode works fine for the most part. The game reuses the bosses as regular enemies later on, which is something that a lot of games do. When you progress, your character should deal more damage in general, so dealing with these enemies is not that hard. You also have a dash attack, double jump, stab attacks when enemies are knocked down, and jump attacks as well. All of these combat moves work fine, and I don't think they are bad or very good, it's a functional combat system. I'm probably not the best person to critique beat-em-up games, but I can certainly talk about how combat feels in these games and if the controls are good. I know that I said the controls are fine, but I wish they are a bit snappier. I played with my Xbox Series X controller on the PC, by the way. Sacred Citadel has some light RPG elements, which seem to be very important, but for all the wrong reasons. I did enjoy getting new weapons and armor, which increased the strength of my character. But when I learned that you basically need to replay previous levels in order to progress, I just quit the game. The last level in Chapter 1 has one of the most aggressive difficulty spikes that I ever experienced. But not because you need some crazy timing in combat, the skill cap is exactly the same like in every previous level. However, all enemies have, I would even dare to say, 10 times more health and they deal way more damage. We're talking about the same enemy types that you fought up to this point, it's ridiculous. I didn't have any issues with controlling enemies on the screen, but it would literally take forever to kill them. So I thought maybe I just need to upgrade my gear, right? Which, by the way, I kinda did, because some enemies will drop new armors and weapons, which were indeed an upgrade. It's very easy to tell when that's the case, it's simple enough. You can also enter the city, where you can buy some new gear, but I already had the best weapons and armor that you can get up to that point. So I realized that you need to level up a lot more and increase your stats in order to even have a decent damage on this level. Like I said, I just refused to do that and I quit the game. Come to think of it, even if the game mechanics felt way better, I would probably do the same, because I think this game design is beyond stupid. When it comes to the level design, I did like how you can use the environment to your advantage, and it seems like most levels have something like this. The visuals of the game are okay, but I think this art style is very bland and uninspiring. There is a decent amount of visual variety when it comes to the levels, but the game is just not very interesting to look at. The story in the game is not even worth mentioning, to be honest. You need to stop the horde of evil bad guys, that's pretty much it. And the dialogue is very bad actually, but not as bad like in Sacred 3. Trust me, you'll see what I'm talking about very soon.
Oh, great warlord! We have found the artifact, but there is a slight problem.
Finally! Where is it? Or is it just really, really small?
The bottom line is, you can take all of this with a grain of salt, because I only invested a couple of hours into this game before I quit. I just didn't enjoy the game enough to replay the levels that I already completed. And overall, I think the problem with the balancing is a big flaw in the game. I would only recommend this game to die-hard beat-em-up fans, or if you and your friends don't have a clue what to play together. Sacred 3 is a game that I already covered semi-recently, not once but a couple of times in various videos. I even made a full dedicated video about Sacred 3, so I'm just going to play with the highlights from that bigger video. This game had a totally different direction and design, which just didn't sit right with the fans of this series.
Okay, you're officially no fun.
Sacred 3 was a linear action-adventure slash brawler, and that design decision alone was a huge departure from previous games. I think the biggest problem with this game is that you could slap any random name to it, and nobody would be able to make a connection with previous Sacred games. Does that mean the game itself was good or bad? Well, let's find out, shall we?
Are they climbing up the wall of that building?
Climb up my wall and something.
When it comes to the visuals, the game aged like fine wine, and anyone with a working pair of eyes will probably think the same. Well, on PC at least. I remember that the console ports were not that good looking and they had some pretty bad performance issues. If you're playing this game on an average PC nowadays, you shouldn't have any problems to run it properly on 4K, high detail settings and locked 60 FPS. I don't remember this game looking so good, and I was pleasantly surprised with the visual variety in the game. Each level has a distinct look to it, with crispy high textures and a very pleasant color palette. The presentation itself is pretty impressive for a top-down action RPG from 2014. All of the scripted scenes look very good and they are filled with detail. The game likes to pan the camera to the side from time to time, where you can see further in the distance of this quote-unquote game world. I mean, sure, these are just scripted scenes and there is no actual game world to explore, the levels are linear as they can be, but nevertheless we have to give props to these talented art designers. Unfortunately, we can't say the same for the people who worked on the story and dialogue, but we'll get to that. I think the colors in this game are very pleasant for the eyes in general. I like the enemy design as well. The majority of bosses you're going to fight look pretty good, while others look uninspired and pretty generic. The playable characters are a hit and miss when it comes to visual design, if you ask me. I mean, we could say the same for the previous game as well, but I think that game did a slightly better job with the character design. What I found really impressive, I don't believe I saw a single low resolution texture on these assets. Well, apart from the distant terrain when the camera pans to the side, but that's just a nitpick. The story, on the other hand, is one of the worst I ever experienced. Why? Well, first of all, the dialogue in this game will make your ears bleed.
I've met the gods. The gods made me. He's no god.
By the sun's might. Maybe it's because I didn't take a shower today.
Trust me on this, because I don't say it lightly, it's literally one of the worst, if not the worst dialogue I ever experienced in a game.
Face it, you don't have the power to defeat my flagship, Gloria.
Why is he calling me Gloria? Oh, never mind.
Now let's not pretend like Sacred 2 had an amazing story and dialogue, because it didn't. Like I said, it was very goofy, but I thought the humor was pretty decent.
Get lost, scum!
The jokes were pretty stupid, but in a funny way, and for the most part, it didn't feel forced.
What do you mean?
Now, I know that humor can be highly subjective, but I think we can all agree that this dialogue is just garbage.
You will lose, you loser!
For some reason they thought it was a good idea to have a narrator who just won't shut the hell up.
Out of the lava, into the traps. Whoa! Who's raining bombs on our parade? There, that elite! Go on, use those explodey guys on the flagship. Oh, I suppose I don't need to whisper. Only you can hear me.
Shut up! Shut up! Shut up!
I really don't see the point of this, especially because Sacred 3 was a linear game. You literally can't screw up or get lost or something. Dying is the worst thing that can happen, and you automatically spawn at the last checkpoint. You know how some games have that hand-holding tutorials, where some character is telling you about the mechanics and how the game works in general? Well, you take that and apply it to the whole game from start to finish and you get Sacred 3. I'm not over-exaggerating, it's exactly how it feels.
Ooh, a furnace. Yeah, that'll work.
And the worst part about this is when you need to do something specific on the level, like turning a wheel. This game should be renamed to Wheel Turning Simulator 3, because every single level has these wheels you need to turn and kill a wave of enemies. Not once, not twice, but 6 fucking times. Some levels even make you do this a couple of times, which is just... I don't know, man, whoever designed this should take a deep look at the mirror. An area just won't stop reminding you about the damn wheel if you don't turn it right away. Oh, and by the way, Aria is the name of the narrator, but who fucking cares about her name? I almost quit the game because of this.
That's the wheel that'll free our people. Clear. Now make your way to the wheel that unlocks the cells. Hello, hello. My name is Wheel. I'm getting lonely. Turn the wheel and the miners are free. Turn the wheel first, fight baddies second. Please hit the wheel. That soldier won't last long. Come on, just flip the flippin' wheel.
Are you out of your mind?
This is hand-holding at its worst, in a game where hand-holding doesn't make sense at all. Speaking of annoying dialogue, 99% of dialogue lines from the main character are like this.
Heads up! This volcano isn't pulling any punches.
I'm hot for you, baby.
Gods be with us. Or at least, don't be against us.
But first, a little romance. You know what I'm saying?
And cue the mercenaries. For each one you take out, it'll be one less marauding in the city.
I'd rather take you out, honey.
We are under alert!
I'd like to be under something else, if you know what I mean.
To make things even worse, Aria never reacts properly, it's like they're not even talking to each other. Her generic lines are obviously meant for all characters in the game and not just for this character. But what about the story itself, C4G? What's it all about? Well, there is this bad guy called Zane and you need to kill him. That's pretty much it. Now let's talk about the gameplay. I can tell you straight away, it's way more fun than I expected. First of all, let's get one thing straight. The gameplay in Sacred 3 is far cry from everything which previous Sacred games established. It's nowhere near customizable or open-ended, but that doesn't mean it's bad. On the contrary, it's actually pretty good for action-adventure standards. That's exactly how I would describe the game. It's a very linear action-adventure with decent combat mechanics and some light RPG elements. The controls are very snappy, which is extremely important for any action combat system which requires a bit of precision. And Sacred 3 does require precision when it comes to positioning and movement. You have to watch your step and move out of the harm's way very often in fights, not just against bosses. The game will throw a ton of enemies at you at once, and you have to utilize all of the abilities you have. Sacred Tree introduces you to a couple of important mechanics which you'll have to use throughout the whole game. The bash is one of the most important mechanics, no matter which character you choose. You will have to interrupt a lot of enemies with this ability, otherwise they will deal a ton of damage to you. Bash is kinda interesting because it's a melee and a ranged ability. Even a lot of bosses will require you to use this mechanic in certain situations, usually to break their shields. Then we have the ability to grab smaller enemies and yeet them across the map, which is kinda cool but not that useful compared to other abilities. The combat is at its best when you combine your abilities with execute mechanic when possible, which makes your character fly around the map. It's very satisfying. What's not so satisfying is the restrain mechanic, which is just confusing to me. You get to use this ability against stronger enemies, and I'm not sure what are the conditions for triggering it. Probably by not taking damage and dealing a lot of damage to the enemy, I'm not sure. It's just a mindless button mash which does some heavy damage, but it locks your character in place. All of your abilities use energy as a resource, and you can regenerate it by using your regular attacks and by breaking these boxes. It's a nice and simple gameplay loop that works pretty good. The balancing of the game is okay, although I feel like the hard difficulty should be normal. I'm not saying that hard is easy because I did die a bunch of times, but it should be a bit more challenging, especially when it comes to boss fights. I think I died only once or twice against all of the bosses, except the end boss. He killed me more than a couple of times. But even that was because of the very stupid mechanic that he does. I don't think the boss fights are that bad in this game. They have more than a couple of mechanics and they look pretty cool. By the way, you get to unlock a new difficulty when you beat the game. I really think they should have used this difficulty as an option from the very beginning.
Oh, baby.
Sacred Tree has an online co-op with up to 4 players, and the servers are still up, surprisingly. I struggled to find anyone to play this game with me online, although I did manage to find another living person, but only after I finished the game. I played with this dude for about 5 minutes, and even that felt laggy, so I don't know about the online co-op nowadays. But check this out, I had no idea that this game has a local co-op on the PC. I only figured that out after I finished the game. So as always, I forced my girlfriend to play with me in the co-op, and it's a lot of fun actually. It took me around 10 hours to beat the game by myself on hard, and I'll probably do it again in co-op now with my girlfriend. Do I recommend this game? Actually yeah, if you don't hold a grudge because of the previous Sacred games. I always try to put myself in the most objective position when I'm reviewing games. Sacred Tree is a horrible Sacred game, but if you don't care about that, you can have at least 10 or a lot more hours of fun. I highly recommend playing it in co-op with someone if you can, if you decide to buy it. If you decide to get the game on GOG, you can use my GOG link in the description. It's a very solid action-adventure / brawler, but don't expect anything more than that. And please turn off the voice volume if you don't want to get bombarded with horrendous dialogue that could make you quit the game very fast.
Why is he calling me Gloria?
And that would cover all the Sacred games. This series definitely had its ups and downs, but unfortunately it didn't end with a bang. Sacred Tree is mostly forgotten nowadays, even though it was not a bad game in general, it was just a terrible Sacred game. That's not an excuse obviously, it's just how it is. However, Sacred and the sequel can be considered as a mandatory classic ARPG, which every new and old fan of this subgenre of RPGs should try. Anyway, I would like to hear your opinion about these Sacred games. Which one did you like the most and why? Leave a comment down below. If you like this video, feel free to check out my other content on the channel. I focus on RPGs and I have a couple of different running series on the channel that you might find interesting. You can also check out some of my t-shirts and hoodies on the official store. I have many different designs in the theme of the channel. Many thanks to all of my channel members and Patreons, and I'll see you in the next one.